It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. When the United States withdrew most troops from Iraq in 2011, after a controversial invasion and troubled occupation, we left behind a politically unstable nation with a shattered military. Those vulnerabilities were quickly taken advantage of by what we now call ISIS, or the Islamic State, a ruthless new organization that seized territory and attention amid the anarchy of post-war Iraq and the growing Syrian civil war. The group's leadership shocked the world with both their willingness to engage in a level of brutality far beyond that of even other terrorists and their sophisticated use of social media and Western-style propaganda for promoting the establishment of a radical Islamist nation spanning the Middle East. In recent months, ISIS attacks have killed scores of people in Paris and Brussels, and an American couple, inspired by the organization, slaughtered more than a dozen innocents in San Bernardino, California. But the roots of ISIS extend far beyond Iraq, and its future, like the changing nature of terrorism itself, remains unpredictable. Our guest today is Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post journalist Joby Warrick. He has written a new book titled Black Flags: The Rise of ISIS, in which he traces the group's development since the 1990s, the background of its founder, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and the ways in which the Bush and Obama administrations may have both missed chances to stop ISIS in its infancy. Joby, thanks for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So this organization that is being characterized by some people, some presidential candidates even, as the United States' greatest adversary in the world right now, but it also has this laundry list of names: ISIS, ISIL, Daesh or Daesh, the Islamic State of Iraq. It was once Al-Qaeda in Iraq, all of these different names.
You know, this is a group that goes back for much longer than people realize. It really had its start in a Jordanian prison back in the late 1990s, where you have a group of radical jihadists who are too extreme for Al-Qaeda, even at the time. In fact, as the story progresses, we see that the leaders of the organization, particularly Zarqawi, the main leader, tries to hook up with Al-Qaeda, and they don't like him. They don't trust him because he is too brutal and too extreme. But because this group became so successful so early, particularly in Iraq, they became a force unto themselves, a rival to Al-Qaeda, and in some ways a more dangerous presence than Al-Qaeda. And that's what we're grappling with today.
But break it down for us in terms of Zarqawi. That's a name that some of us know. He's now long dead, killed in a drone strike some years ago, but still remembered as the spiritual leader and the founder and really the architect of this organization. But so back in the 1990s, in those early origins of it, what was it then? I mean, it wasn't called ISIS, but also who was Zarqawi?
Yeah, Zarqawi was probably the least likely person to ever run a terrorist organization. When he started, he was illiterate, well, not entirely illiterate. He could speak a little bit of, read a little bit of Arabic, but he dropped out of high school. He was a hoodlum and a thug and a guy who had been involved in drugs. He had tattoos. He was probably the least likely person you'd want to have in this role. But he had a strong personality, a ton of charisma, and also some very radical ideas. And because he was almost illiterate, and because he didn't understand the Quran very well, he was very happy to twist religion to his own advantages because he didn't rely on scholarship, he didn't rely on theologians. He thought he knew what Allah wanted him to do. So in that sense, he felt almost divinely inspired to lead this organization. Osama bin Laden, as murderous and terrible a guy he was, he did have a program, a kind of a logical progression that he was trying to follow. These guys are trying to make noise and just create chaos, and they do it in very smart ways sometimes, but they do it in very brutal ways. And they embrace brutality as part of their methodology. So we see them in the early days, in Zarqawi era, beheading people and broadcasting on the internet. It shocked people in the Arab world. But for him, it was that sort of radical message, this brutal message of Islam that was his calling card. And that's still what ISIS is today.
he's not just trying to get U.S. forces out of Saudi Arabia. I mean, that was the prime motivating factor for Osama bin Laden in the beginning.
Yeah, there are a few powerful ideas that he latches on to that continue to be a draw to recruits around the world today. One of them is this idea of building the caliphate, which is something that Al-Qaeda and that generation of jihadists talked about in the abstract. But Zarqawi had this notion that if you build the thing, if you actually create something tangible, then it becomes an inspiration to people around the world who want to help your cause. And he also saw this inevitability to his movement, that over time he would be rewarded by Allah himself, and also he would usher in this end times battle. So it's very much part of the conversation. Even back in the early 2000s, he would talk about this great end battle that would take place not in Iraq, where he was fighting, but in Syria. And he named a particular village in Syria called Dabiq, which is part of the sort of there's some Quranic or Hadith writings that talk about this end time struggle in Dabiq. And he said that this is going to be the big showdown between the army of the West and the army of Allah. And essentially, his followers are marching toward that battle as we speak.
And so Zarqawi is this guy who is involved in crime in Jordan. He's Jordanian. But so Jordanian intelligence is tracking him to some degree, but he seems to be a fairly minor guy. He's imprisoned. He actually is trained up in a sense. I mean, he sort of finds himself in prison, realizes that he's a good leader, realizes that he can organize people inside prison, and he associates with his first religious advisor while he's in prison. So in a way, he's trained in the Jordanian prison that is a special place for quasi-terrorists, I guess.
Yeah.
But then he comes out, he starts an organization, but it is still pretty obscure. But then there's this moment, I want to sort of skip up to this, but there's this moment just before the invasion of Iraq where he and his nascent group are at a training camp out in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish area, sort of ungoverned area of northern Iraq. And there's a CIA agent or operative named Sam Faddis who's in the vicinity and watching these guys, and finish that story. What happens?
This is really an extraordinary moment because this is the time you've got Al-Qaeda essentially has been driven out of Afghanistan. So they're on the run. And one of the many exiles from Afghanistan is Zarqawi, who had his own little training camp in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. He ends up fleeing to the border area between Iraq and Iran, this no man's land where we're essentially above the no-fly zone, so he's fairly safe there. But he really is a nobody. I mean, if you look back at his early history, the things they had done before was they assassinated a U.S. diplomat, which is probably their main achievement. But other things had been just trying to blow up symbols of Western corruption. They actually went into a pornographic theater, before he went into prison and tried to blow this place up just as a protest. The bomber gets in there with his bomb, gets so engrossed in the film, he forgets what he's doing, blows up under his feet, and he actually loses both his legs and nobody else gets hurt. But these are the kind of knuckleheads they were. Not a very inspired group. And it was a great story, too, about how when he finally did come to some prominence, journalists were hunting him down. They went to his hometown and talked to his mom and said, how about your son, this great terrorist? And she said, he's not that smart. What are you talking about?
Can't be him.
He surprised everyone. And so, yeah, this is his moment where these relatively unaccomplished people were hiding out, and we had opportunities to take them out because this is right before the Iraq War started. The American government realized that they were potentially dangerous. They had a little chemical weapons factory they had cooked up there where they were poisoning dogs with cyanide and that kind of thing. And the U.S. administration considered very carefully, at least 3 times, whether we would launch a preemptive strike and destroy this little cell. But they didn't do it because we were right on the verge of the invasion of Iraq. And there was some fear that if we went in and did something that would upset the schedule, upset our allies, maybe tip off Saddam Hussein too early, then the whole thing could come crashing down. So this was a missed opportunity. By the time they did go in and try to take out Zarqawi and his gang, the war had already started. Zarqawi had run to Baghdad to get ready for the Americans, and it was too late.
But so by then, though, Zarqawi is a name that some people in the West have heard. Now, but not shortly before that, he's actually, except to Jordanian intelligence and maybe the CIA to some degree, nobody really has heard of him. No American citizen just following the news had probably heard of Zarqawi until Colin Powell goes to speak to the United Nations to make the case essentially for the invasion of Iraq. But what exactly happened there, and why was it that this obscure terrorist ends up as part of that speech to the UN?
We all remember that speech, and that's where the weapons of mass destruction claim was made for the UN Security Council in a very powerful way. It turned out that was completely wrong intelligence. But at the same time, the other link we tried to make in that speech was to connect Al-Qaeda, the authors of the 9/11 attack, with Saddam Hussein's government. There wasn't much evidence. It was very circumstantial. There was an office at the Pentagon, the Office of Special Plans. It was trying to argue that there were connections and Saddam was somehow in cahoots with some of these al-Qaeda terrorists. The best strand of evidence they had was this guy named Zarqawi, who had been living in northern Iraq. He was essentially in Iraqi territory, even if it was forbidden for Saddam Hussein to go there. But he had had past associations with Osama bin Laden. So it was a plausible connection. And Colin Powell plays this up very big in his speech. He actually put Zarqawi's picture up on the big screen saying, this is our poster child. This is what we're worried about, this nexus between a dictator and a very dangerous terrorist group. It turns out it was completely wrong because Zarqawi had no connection with the Iraqis at all. They were studying him just like we were studying him. They were afraid of him. And they certainly had no influence over him, and they weren't giving him anything. But that became part of the pretense that precipitated our invasion of Iraq. By doing that, we not only sort of set this conflict in motion, but we also gave this guy great celebrity. And this is actually, interestingly, the one part of the case that the CIA got right. Because there were analysts at the agency who knew Zarqawi. They knew what his story was. They understood that he was a bad guy and dangerous in his own way, but they also knew he had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. And the wishful thinking, I think, was that with people in the Bush administration, particularly in the Pentagon, wanting to draw that connection, grasping at the smallest shreds of evidence to try to make this case that somehow Saddam Hussein had been part of 9/11 or somehow he could help al-Qaeda. And that was a very important part of the case for the American people, to say that there was some link between 9/11 and this guy we wanted to take over, to knock out of Baghdad. But it ended up having enormous consequences, and these sort of this chain of events all gets launched really with the invasion of Iraq a few months later.
Interestingly enough, in the previous episode of this program, we had as our guest Eric Edelman, who was the National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney at the time that these decisions were being made. The very first thing he said was, I have no doubt that Iraq is better without Saddam Hussein, so that may be true. But then he said, I have no doubt that he was working on weapons of mass destruction programs. And then a few seconds later he said the programs were ongoing, there's no question that he'd produced these weapons in the past, had used them on his neighbors in his own population, that's true. But then we had every reason to believe he was still planning to develop those programs. It essentially was a sort of reaffirmation of the speech that also gave us Zarqawi. But as a national security reporter, who's followed all this, what's your reaction to that?
Well, it's consistent, that's for sure. I mean, Dick Cheney's memoir coming out just a couple of years ago essentially made the same justification that, well, we didn't find WMD. In fact, Cheney acknowledges that. But he still believes that they did the right thing based on the intelligence they had. And they also do think that history will judge them fairly or show them being right in their decision. That's a much harder argument to make now, given the mess that the Middle East is in. I don't know of any analysts, even the intelligence community, that follow this pretty closely, that see it as anything other than a disaster that really unleashed forces that we're having to deal with for decades afterward.
I want us to talk some about Obama. What was the counsel to President Obama at a linchpin moment when the United States perhaps could have taken a very different approach to Syria? What were they advising him, and what was his reaction to it?
If you think about what was going on in Syria at the time, so the revolution starts, or the uprising starts in the spring of 2011, so we just passed the 5-year anniversary. And so you have fairly successful revolutions in Tunisia, a very complicated one in Libya, and in Syria, just all hell breaking loose, literally. A dictator who's just putting his foot down and becoming very brutal toward his own people. And so I think it was a challenge for this administration, wanting to get ourselves out of Middle East conflicts and really kind of pushing back against the administration's own advisors about how to best navigate this new movement. We had all kinds of problems with the Russians, blocking any effort at the UN to help in any meaningful way, or to have even sanctions against the Assad regime. And so the limited options available were to let's support moderate rebels, let's try to help somehow close this vacuum that's come to exist. But those are very hard decisions and very hard choices. It's hard even now to look back and say that if we would have armed rebels in Syria, it would have made a big difference. But this firm decision was made in 2012 that we essentially wanted to leave it alone, let it play out itself. And ISIS very, very, smartly exploited that situation, exploited that vacuum to come to power.
But there are plans to to try to arm the rebels, to arm the right rebels, and take a much more muscular approach in that period. And in the end, at least by some accounts, it's President Obama himself who essentially says, no, we're not going to do that.
It was a key moment, and it's in early 2012 when you do have advisors like Hillary and Vice President Biden and also Panetta, Petraeus, all these people essentially arguing that it's time we do something to try to help the situation. It's really getting quickly out of control. I talked to some of the NSC people who were there at the time, and they were watching these bad guys come into Syria and becoming more and more powerful, getting more recruits coming from the outside. And they were becoming very alarmed about what was happening in that security vacuum. And the president looked at that and he took it very seriously. And there were a number of meetings in which it was discussed. But he ended up having what essentially was a minority view within his own cabinet, which is that the question he asked was, can you point to a situation where we got involved helping an insurgency and it's really turned out well for us? Is this going to be where is this going to go? What's the outcome? Can we arm these rebels and really expect they're going to be able to defeat Assad, who's backed by the Russians, who's backed by the Iranians? So he raised really good questions. It was sort of the majority opinion in his own cabinet, but it turned out to be the view that prevailed.
But here we have the Russians pop up and arrive in a very significant way, and then pull back out. And which one could say, well, that's an example. Why couldn't the U.S. have done the same thing? They didn't get bogged down. They're not stuck there taking losses every single day. Do we lack the imagination somehow to realize that there is a way to engage in a very muscular way and then get back out before you're in a deep bog?
Hillary very smartly called this the problem from hell. I think for Russia it was a more easy decision because they're helping an ally that actually did have the ability and the forces on the ground to retake territory. So they essentially gave Assad's forces the boost they needed to retake Palmyra, we just saw this past week, and to take over other parts of the country that they'd lost to ISIS. For us, it would have been a matter of who are we arming? Who are we supporting? We're arming people that aren't really trained fighters for the most part. They have limited means. Would it have made a big difference? Could we have bombed our way out of the problem? We've certainly been trying that for the last few months with some, fairly limited success. So it was a tougher thing for us to do, I think.
We have crossed off, if you go back to that original list of al-Qaeda bad guys that was put out right after 9/11, a huge majority of them are dead, if not all of them, of those playing cards with their faces on them that were distributed by the U.S. government. But so in the end, does it do any good?
Zarqawi was a big loss, I would argue, just because he was such a presence, such a charismatic leader, and it took the organization a while to recover from that. Even today, though, it's interesting that he's almost become an iconic figure in a way that Osama bin Laden was, and maybe even more, because when you look at jihadist videos and literature, and they lionize Zarqawi still, because he was the guy with the machine gun and so looked like a ninja when he wore American Nike sneakers and cut off Americans' heads with his own hands. And so he was someone who continues to inspire, and I think that was a big loss that he was killed. At the same time, one of the things that's interesting about ISIS is that logistically they're very smart. They're very good at building an organization, about having parts of the chain that can fill in if one part gets taken out. So even amidst all these airstrikes and all this pressure from various fronts, they still run countries. They still have their caliphate that operates as a state, and they still have an infrastructure that can pay troops on time and deliver ammunition and that sort of thing. So they're kind of discounting the loss of leaders, which they do. That does happen from time to time. Eventually, if you start taking out too many mid-level managers and too many of the senior ones, it gets more hard for them to operate, and I think we're trying really hard to do that.
There actually aren't very many Americans who have volunteered and become part of this, far more Europeans who have done that. It's still sort of inexplicable to Americans, I think, of how, particularly someone who is fully inculcated into American culture, this place that most Muslims say this is actually the friendliest place in the world to live a life as a Muslim.
We've seen probably 100 different reasons why people join, and everything from people just looking for adventure, and it looks like a big video game, so they go off to play Call of Duty, except it's in Syria. But I think what seems to be most attractive to most of the ones that we've looked at is this idea of the caliphate. It's not just joining some shadowy terrorist organization where you're living underground and maybe going to carry out some deed. They're joining a cause. And for them, it's the greatest cause of modern times because they're rewriting history. A century ago, at the end of World War I, the Allies divided the Middle East into countries that didn't exist before. They took what was once kind of a Muslim caliphate, at least in their minds, and turned them into states that would be oriented to the West and would sell products to the West. they're rewriting that whole history. They're reasserting this legitimacy of an Islamic state. And that's a very powerful notion, even to people who aren't jihadists. It really resonates with a lot of them. And you throw onto that this idea that Allah is coming back and there's this great end times battle. Why wouldn't you want to be part of that? So it's a very attractive message for a lot of, especially first, second generation immigrants from North Africa and from the Middle East who live in Europe.
Yeah, it sort of sounds terrible to say this. It will sound terrible to some, but I for myself, I think the sort of dawning moment of, okay, I think I get this thing now finally, was when I realized that these passions, these religiously based passions about this idea of the end times and this desire to be part of this final, union with Allah in a sense, and I reached back into my own fundamentalist Christian, roots and realized that, okay, it's not that different in terms of what the appeal of this thing and why it is that we end up able to believe things that on a purely rational basis don't seem to quite add up, but put into this narrative becomes a very, very powerful thing. And the sad thing, of course, is that almost all of these young men in particular who volunteer to do this thing end up dead.
It's interesting. We've spent a lot of time studying the militants who were involved in the Paris strikes and the Brussels strikes, which everyone's familiar with. And you see an additional overlay with some of these. Some of them were very troubled men, very much like Zarqawi in a way. People who came from they were high school dropouts, they'd been in jail, they'd been in trouble. And this, the sense of the caliphate, the sense of fighting for Allah is a way for them to turn their lives around. And you see that same pattern again and again, troubled young men who really had no passion for an idea for their lives, ending up becoming very devoted to this cause. And these are the ones that are willing to not only potentially be suicide bombers, but commit atrocities, because they do feel like they've got a cause that's important, and it's the most important cause in the world for them.
Anyone who can see how many tabs I have on the book can see how closely I read it. But as the book is ending, what has happened is this perhaps the most horrifying atrocity committed by ISIS, and that is this captured Jordanian fighter pilot is burned alive, and that's recorded and broadcast out on the internet. But there is this great outcry, and the book ends on a somewhat optimistic sense with this scene of more Jordanian pilots flying off into the sunset, and kind of it felt a little bit to me like the end of a World War II movie, and a sense that finally the good guys are waking up and are going to aggressively crush this terrible thing. But it doesn't feel that way now, a year or 14 months later. So what happened?
I think we can hopefully look at this in a few years from now and still see this as a turning point, because you can't understate the importance of these Arab governments, these Muslim governments, as allies to us. And when you see them getting upset to a person by this awful death of this pilot, who wasn't just executed but was burned alive, which is something that's explicitly forbidden by the Quran. So they didn't seem to sometimes react so horribly to his beheadings, but something about this burning of a human being, a Sunni Muslim, by ISIS, suddenly you saw the popularity of this group in opinion polls just plummet to the low single digits. ISIS in its home territory is under pressure. They've lost something like 40% of the territory they held a year ago. And it's not just military defeats, which they're getting from all sides, on the ground as well as on the air, but they're losing finances. The oil flow that used to have the huge black market oil flow to Turkey and other places, now their infrastructure's been destroyed. They don't have tankers anymore to move it. They don't have oil refineries anymore. Well, it's been destroyed. So they are lashing out to show that they're still relevant, to show they're still powerful. At the same time, they've managed to seed the organization across the world. There are at least 8 official mini caliphates that exist in places like Libya, Yemen, even in Afghanistan now, and 50 other sort of wannabes, acolyte organizations that claim to be part of ISIS's network. And even worse, you have this problem of 35,000 people who've come through ISIS's ranks and have been trained and indoctrinated, at least 5,000 to 6,000 from Europe, many of them back home again. So regardless of what happens in the caliphate, this is a problem that continues to give us headaches for many years to come.
A year from now, there'll be a new president. If there's a new president who's recently been inaugurated and you're fortunate enough that you get to sit down with that person for 10 or 15 minutes and the new president says, Joby, tell me the one thing or the two things that are the most important things. I don't have time to read your book. What are the two things I really need to know or need to do to try to get back on a better path for the United States in Syria or in this the battle with ISIS?
I think probably job one is to make very clear that we and our friends, our allies in the Muslim world are on the same side in this fight. You see more courageous leaders such as Jordan's King Abdullah starting this movement called the Amman Message, where he's getting religious leaders from all around the world, from every sect you can think of, getting together around a message that says Islam is a tolerant religion. We reject these extremist messages. We want to send this message not just as religious leaders, but we want to put it down in the local mosque. We want to make sure that people, in religious universities and schools are communicating this view of Islam. This is something we need to get around and help them to make this message very clear, because it's not a fight that's going to be over next month or next year. Even if we manage to destroy this caliphate in Syria, we've got a very long-term fight ahead of us, and we need good Muslim allies on our side, and we need to make that clear, I think, from the White House on down.
Well, thank you for writing this book that I think has brought a kind of clarity to all of this in a way that I didn't have before, and that I think people really should read. And I don't say that about every book. But Joby Warrick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it.
The book is Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS. We hope you'll join this conversation with American Forum on the Miller Center Facebook page, or by following us on Twitter at Douglas Blackman, or at American Forum TV, or at Joby Warrick. Send us a comment, watch other episodes, download podcasts, get a transcript, or to read more about fresh approaches to the next president's first year in office, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next week.